Few topics generate more discussion, curiosity, and controversy in genealogy than Native American ancestry claims in Appalachia. Across the mountains of Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and neighboring regions, countless families have passed down stories of Indigenous ancestors. Many people grew up hearing that a grandmother was Cherokee, that a distant ancestor was Native American, or that Native heritage had been intentionally hidden. Some of these stories are supported by documentation. Others contain kernels of truth mixed with generations of family legend. Still others emerged from misunderstandings, assumptions, or attempts to explain complicated family histories. In this series, we are not here to prove or disprove anyone's identity. Instead, we will examine the historical circumstances that caused these stories to become so widespread throughout Appalachia. Many researchers eventually encounter a remarkably similar story. Perhaps it was a grandmother who claimed Native ancestry. Maybe it was an old photograph. Sometimes it was a whispered family secret passed down through generations. The details vary, but the themes are often familiar. A Cherokee ancestor, a hidden Native grandmother, a family that supposedly concealed its identity. These stories are so common that they have become part of Appalachian folklore. The question is not why one family tells these stories. The question is why thousands of families tell remarkably similar stories. To answer that question, we need to understand the history of the Appalachian frontier. One of the biggest misconceptions about Appalachian history is the belief that the region was isolated and culturally uniform. In reality, Appalachia was a crossroads. Numerous indigenous nations lived throughout the region long before European settlement. The Cherokee, Shawnee, Catawba, Monacan, Tutelo, Yuchi, and many others interacted with settlers, traders, missionaries, and neighboring tribes. European settlers arrived from many backgrounds including English, Scottish, Scots-Irish, German, Welsh, and French communities. Enslaved and free people of African descent were also part of the region's history. These populations did not always remain separate. The frontier was often messy, fluid, and complex. This mixing of populations created the conditions for family stories that would survive centuries. Genealogists sometimes make the mistake of dismissing family stories simply because they cannot immediately prove them. That approach can be dangerous. Oral histories frequently preserve genuine historical events, even when specific details become distorted over time. A family story about a Cherokee ancestor may not literally involve a Cherokee ancestor. However, it could reflect an indigenous connection, a mixed ancestry line, an adoption, a frontier relationship, or an ancestor who was perceived as native by the community. The story itself becomes evidence, not proof, but evidence. Our responsibility as researchers is to investigate rather than dismiss. Perhaps no ancestry story is more famous than the Cherokee Princess. Millions of Americans have heard some version of this tale. The problem is that traditional Cherokee society did not have princesses in the European sense of the word. So where did this story come from? In many cases, descendants were attempting to describe an ancestor who held status, influence, or leadership within an indigenous community. Over time, later generations translated unfamiliar cultural roles into terms they recognized. A respected woman eventually became a princess. A tribal leader became a chief. The story changed as it passed from generation to generation. The myth often reflects cultural misunderstanding rather than intentional deception. There were periods in American history when openly identifying as Indigenous could carry serious consequences. Communities faced discrimination, displacement, violence, legal restrictions, and social stigma. In some cases, families deliberately concealed their heritage to protect themselves and their children. They may have adopted new identities. They may have changed how they described themselves. They may have avoided discussing ancestry altogether. Generations later, descendants sometimes inherited fragments of those hidden stories without understanding the historical reasons behind them. This is one reason why Native ancestry stories can be difficult to verify today. The Appalachian frontier was not a hard boundary separating cultures. It was a place where people interacted constantly. Families traded together, worked together, married across cultural lines, and sometimes lived in the same communities for generations. Frontier records often reveal relationships that do not fit neatly into modern racial categories. Some families moved between native communities and colonial settlements. Others were adopted into tribal communities or maintained close relationships with indigenous neighbors. The reality was often far more complicated than the categories found in later government records. One of the most challenging aspects of Appalachian genealogy is the way racial classifications changed over time. An ancestor might appear under one classification in one record and a completely different classification in another. Government officials often made subjective decisions based on appearance, local reputation, personal bias, or community assumptions. As a result, many families left behind records that seem contradictory. These inconsistencies can fuel family stories and create confusion for modern researchers. Understanding historical record keeping is essential before drawing conclusions. Native ancestry stories continue because they touch something deeply personal. People want to understand who they are. They want to understand where they came from. They want to connect with family history and preserve the memories passed down by earlier generations. For many families, these stories are about more than genetics. They are about identity, belonging, resilience, and heritage. That emotional connection helps explain why these narratives persist even when documentation is limited. When encountering Native ancestry claims, genealogists should approach the subject with both curiosity and respect. Neither blind acceptance nor immediate dismissal serves the truth. Instead, we should gather records, analyze evidence, study historical context, and compare oral history with documentation. Family stories deserve investigation. Records deserve careful analysis. DNA deserves proper interpretation. Only by combining all three can we begin to understand the complex histories hidden within Appalachian families. In Part 2, we will explore the historical foundations that shaped Appalachian populations. We will examine colonial Virginia, frontier migration patterns, Indigenous displacement, Scots-Irish settlement, free people of color, and the diverse communities that emerged in the mountain regions. Understanding who lived in Appalachia and how these populations interacted is critical to understanding why Native ancestry stories became so widespread. The answers are often far more fascinating than the myths themselves. The hidden history of Native American ancestry claims in Appalachia is ultimately a story about people. It is a story about memory. It is a story about survival. It is a story about identity. Some family traditions will prove accurate. Others will evolve into something different when examined through records and DNA evidence. But every story deserves thoughtful investigation. As genealogists, our job is not to prove family legends right or wrong. Our job is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Thank you so much for joining me for Part 1 of the hidden history of Native American ancestry claims in Appalachia. I hope this presentation has provided valuable insight into why Native ancestry stories are so common throughout Appalachian families, and why these stories deserve thoughtful investigation rather than immediate acceptance or dismissal. If you enjoyed this presentation, please take a moment to like, subscribe, share, and follow.